Daniel Okafor was 38 years old when his wife, Priya, handed him their dog's leash, set a cardboard box on the front step of the house they had shared for 11 years, kissed him once on the cheek like you kiss a relative you see twice a year, and drove away with a man named Stefan Voss, who wore linen shirts and described himself on LinkedIn as a creative visionary. The box held a phone charger he didn't recognize, a coffee mug from a conference he hadn't attended, 3 birthday cards she'd saved from her own birthdays that he'd written by hand, and at the very bottom, beneath everything, a key on a plain brass ring with a faded blue tag that said, Storage Unit C14. She had forgotten it was in there. She had forgotten it existed. Priya had never, in 11 years, thought to ask what was in C14. She had no idea that C14 held the only copy of a notarized trust document naming Daniel the sole beneficiary of his grandmother's commercial real estate portfolio. 9 properties across the city of Atlanta, valued 18 months prior at $4.1 million, and rising. What Priya set in motion the afternoon she drove away with Stefan Voss would cost her the settlement she had already spent in her head. Before we get into the story, drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from, and subscribe, because tomorrow's story will have you talking about it all week. The alarm went off at 5:14 a.m. The way it always had. Daniel reached across the bed, touched the cold side where Priya used to sleep, and got up. He filled a thermos with coffee, black, 2 minutes steep in the French press, no shortcuts, pulled on a gray Henley and work pants, and stood at the kitchen counter for a moment, looking out the window at the backyard while the city outside was still dark and the dog, a 6-year-old Rhodesian Ridgeback named Kofi, was still turning slow circles on his bed in the corner. Daniel worked in architectural preservation. He had spent the last 9 years consulting for property owners, municipalities, and developers on the structural and aesthetic rehabilitation of historic buildings, the kind of buildings that other architects looked at and saw liability, and that Daniel looked at and saw the specific intelligence of a craftsman who had been dead for 100 years and whose decisions were still holding weight. He could walk into a building that had been standing since 1910 and tell you within 20 minutes what was original, what had been modified, what the modification had done to the load distribution, and what needed to happen next. His clients included the City of Atlanta's Office of Buildings, a historic preservation nonprofit on Peachtree Street, and 3 private developers who paid him well because he was right. He drove a 2013 Honda CR-V with a cracked passenger side mirror he'd been meaning to replace for 2 years. The crack had happened when he'd backed too close to the mailbox at his grandmother's house in Decatur. He had not replaced the mirror because the mirror still functioned and the crack did not affect his sightline. He drove the CR-V to job sites, to client meetings, to his grandmother Estelle's house every Sunday for dinner, to the storage facility off Candler Road to check on C14 twice a year. He drove it the way he did everything, practically, attentively, without ceremony. Kofi trotted to the kitchen at 5:25 and sat beside him while he finished his coffee. Daniel scratched behind his ear. Kofi was a serious dog, calm, watchful, not given to excess enthusiasm unless the occasion genuinely warranted it. Priya had picked him out at the shelter 4 years ago and had loved him in the intense and then gradually distracted way she had loved most things. Fully, then less fully, then as background. By the last year of their marriage, she barely noticed him when she came in. Daniel had noticed. Kofi had noticed. They had not discussed it. The marriage had not ended suddenly. It had thinned. Over 18 months, Daniel had watched it thin the way old plaster thins, still holding its shape on the surface, still appearing solid from a distance, but losing its bond to the underlying structure slowly and completely, in a process that is only obvious once something applies pressure and the whole face falls away at once. Priya had applied pressure in the form of Stefan Voss, a man she had met at a branding conference in Nashville and who texted her, for 3 months, things that Daniel found on her phone on a Thursday evening in October when she left it unlocked on the kitchen counter, and it buzzed 3 times in a row. He had read 4 messages. He had set the phone face down on the counter, exactly where she had left it, and gone to make dinner. He did not confront her that night. He did not confront her the following week. He went to bed on time. He drove to work in the morning. He stopped at the storage facility on a Saturday and stood in front of the metal door of C14 and looked at the padlock for a moment. And then he went inside and sat on the old wooden stool he kept in the corner and thought through the situation with the same methodical care he applied to a load-bearing assessment. When he left, he locked the door. He drove home. He made soup. He took Kofi for a long walk around the neighborhood in the November chill, both of them moving at an easy pace, neither of them in a hurry. Priya told him about Stefan in January. She said it at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around a mug of tea, using a tone he recognized as rehearsed, calm, direct, pre-processed. She said she had tried to make it work in her head. She said she hadn't meant for it to happen this way. She said she still cared about him, Daniel, deeply, as a person. She said she thought she needed something different, something more. He listened to all of it without interrupting. When she was done, he said, "Okay?" She said, "That's all?" He said, "What would you like me to say?" She looked at him for a moment with an expression he had seen before, the expression she wore when she couldn't locate a reaction in him that she had been prepared for. She had been prepared for anger, or grief, or a negotiation. She had not been prepared for okay. She filed for divorce 11 days later. His attorney's name was Roland Mead. He had an office on Edgewood Avenue with dark paneling on the walls and a framed Georgia bar certificate above the credenza and the organized, unhurried manner of a man who had been doing this long enough to have seen every version of the story at least twice. When Daniel came in with the full documentation, the trust instrument from his grandmother Estelle, the property valuations, the asset protection structure that Estelle's estate attorney had built with the specific intention of keeping the portfolio out of marital claims, Roland reviewed it for a while, without speaking. He set it down. He said, "Your grandmother's attorney built this to survive exactly this kind of proceeding. The trust was established and fully funded before the marriage. The beneficial interest was assigned to you before the marriage. There is no legitimate claim here." He paused. "In 21 years of family law, this is one of the cleaner premarital asset positions I have reviewed." Daniel said, "Is there anything she can claim?" Roland said, "The marital home has equity. You'll split that. Everything else, the trust assets, the portfolio income, all of it, is yours. She doesn't have a line into it." Daniel said, "Okay." He said, "Let's be thorough anyway." Roland said, "Always." What Priya believed during the divorce proceedings was that Daniel was a man of modest professional income, the consulting fees, solid but not spectacular, and the equity in their house in Kirkwood. What she believed, because she had never asked and he had never offered, was that his grandmother Estelle was a woman who had worked as a school teacher for 34 years and lived in a small house in Decatur and made spectacular Sunday dinners and kept a vegetable garden out back that was the pride of the neighborhood. This was true. What Priya did not know, because she had not asked and the information had not been decorated, was that Estelle's late husband, Daniel's grandfather James, had spent 30 years buying commercial property in Atlanta's historically black neighborhoods on the conviction that the city would grow toward them. He had been correct. He had been spectacularly correct. He had paid for most of it in cash. and left the rest to Estelle in a trust she had managed with the same quiet precision she applied to everything else in her life. Estelle had added to it. Slowly, methodically, without announcement. She had told Daniel about it when he was 32, sitting at her kitchen table on a Sunday, in the same unhurried tone she used to tell him anything that mattered. She had shown him the documents. She had said, "This is yours when I'm gone, but it's yours now in trust. You should know what you're holding." He had asked questions. She had answered them. He had driven to the storage unit on Candler Road the following Saturday and placed the notarized trust document in the fireproof box in C14, because the unit was climate-controlled and the box was fireproof, and those seemed like the appropriate conditions for an important piece of paper. He had not told Priya because Priya had not asked about his grandmother's finances, and it had not occurred to him to volunteer it unprompted any more than he would volunteer the tensile rating of the structural steel in a building he was working on. It was information. It was available. No one had asked. Estelle died in the February that Daniel and Priya separated. She died at 79, in her own home, in her own bed, with the vegetable garden already planning itself for spring. At the funeral, which was held at the church she had attended for 40 years, the pews were full, and the reception afterward went for 3 hours. Priya did not attend. She and Daniel had already been living separately for 6 weeks, and she sent a card that Daniel found on the counter and left there for 2 days before setting it on the stack of mail he was getting to. The trust transferred fully to Daniel on the date of Estelle's death, as documented. 9 commercial properties. 2 of them had tenants mid-lease. 3 were being evaluated for potential sale. 1 was in the early stages of a rehabilitation project that Daniel had begun consulting on himself as both trustee and preservation architect, which was the kind of overlap that had made Roland Mead smile briefly when Daniel explained it. The total portfolio value, as assessed in March, was $4.7 million. It had appreciated during the 6 months of the divorce proceedings. Priya's attorney was a capable woman who reviewed Daniel's disclosures carefully and asked the right questions about the trust and received, through Roland, the correct and complete legal answer, established before marriage, funded before marriage, beneficial interest assigned before marriage, no marital contribution to the portfolio, no legitimate claim in a Georgia equitable distribution proceeding. She reviewed this answer. She consulted a second opinion. The second opinion agreed with Roland. She went back to Priya with the information. Priya called Daniel 3 times that week. He answered the 3rd call on a Wednesday evening while Kofi was sleeping at his feet, and he was going through the Edgewood tenant lease renewals at the kitchen table. She said, "I need you to explain this to me." He said, "Explain what?" She said, "The properties, the trust, your grandmother." He said, "What would you like to know?" She said, "How long has this existed?" He said the trust was established in 1987. My grandfather started buying the properties in the late 1950s. She was quiet for a moment. She said, "You never told me." He said, "You never asked about Estelle's finances, or mine, beyond what we needed to make the household work." She said, Daniel, that's $4 million." He said, 4.7, as of the March assessment. She said nothing for 3 seconds. He said, "Priya, what would you have done differently?" She didn't answer. He said, "I'm not asking to be unkind. I'm asking because I genuinely want to know if there was something I was supposed to do differently." She said, quietly, "I would have stayed." He said, "I know." He said it without anger, without satisfaction, as a statement of fact about a real and sad thing. Then, he said he needed to get back to the lease renewals, and he hoped she was doing okay, and he said good night. She called 7 more times across April. He answered twice. The conversations were brief and arrived at the same destination. The settlement was finalized in late April in Rollins' conference room, the Kirkwood house equity divided evenly, the trust assets documented and protected, the personal property already sorted. Priya got half the house equity, which was fair. She got her car, her accounts, her things. She got the coffee machine and the good knives. She did not get C-14. She had not remembered the key. She had put it in the box without thinking, a spare she'd found in the kitchen junk drawer while she was packing, and she had not thought about what it opened. She had not thought about it because she had never thought about it, had never been curious about the storage unit on Candler Road, had passed it 100 times on the way to other places and registered it as background. The morning the divorce was finalized, Daniel drove to the storage unit before going to the office. He parked the car V in the lot, walked to C-14, used his key, the original, and unlocked the door. He went inside. The fireproof box was on the shelf where it always was. He opened it. The trust documents were inside. He looked at them for a moment. He closed the box. He closed the unit. He locked it. He got back in the Kia RV and drove to his first site visit of the day, a 1923 commercial building on Auburn Avenue that a developer wanted to gut for luxury condos and that Daniel had been hired to assess for preservation viability. He parked, pulled on his jacket, took his notebook out of the inside pocket, and went in. The building had been standing for 100 years. The interior plaster was cracked in the upper southeast corner where the roof had leaked at some point, but the lath behind it was solid. The original floor joists were Doug fir, old growth, denser than anything they made now. Someone in 1923 had built this to last, and it had lasted. The bones were good. You just had to know what you were looking at. He spent 2 hours inside, moving from room to room, touching walls, testing floors, making notes in his small handwriting on the legal pad. When he was done, he stood in the center of the ground floor and looked up at the ceiling, at the pressed tin panels someone had installed in the 1940s that had survived everything since. He made a final note. He walked out. Kofi was at home, on his bed in the kitchen corner, waiting in the calm and serious way he waited for everything. Daniel got home at 6:15, fed him, took him for a long walk down the block and around the park. The evening was warm, and the neighborhood smelled of someone's charcoal starting up and cut grass, and the specific spring smell of Atlanta that arrived in late April, like a reminder that the city had not forgotten how to be generous. They walked without hurrying. Kofi moved at Daniel's pace, occasionally pausing to investigate something with the focused attention of a dog who took his responsibilities seriously and did not perform. Daniel walked and thought about the Auburn Avenue building and the Dougford joists and the tin ceiling and what it would take to make the case for full preservation to a developer who was already pricing luxury units in his head. He could make the case. He had made harder ones. They circled the park once and headed home. The porch light was on. He'd put it on a timer 2 months ago, a small thing, but it meant the house looked lived in and warm when he turned the corner and saw it from down the block. He went up the steps. He unlocked the door. He and Kofi went inside. He sat at the kitchen table and opened the Auburn Avenue file and worked until 9 o'clock, making notes, pulling comparable preservation cases, drafting the outline of an argument. At 9 he closed the file and washed his cup and turned off the kitchen light. He went to his grandmother's chair. He'd brought it from Estelle's house. A wide wooden armchair with worn arms and the particular solidity of furniture that has been sat in for decades by someone who knew how to be still. And he sat in it for a while in the quiet house, with Kofi stretched out at his feet on the floor. The trust was his. The properties were his. The work was his. Kofi was his. The key was in C14 on a brass ring with a faded blue tag. He had left it there. He did not need it tonight. He did not need it to remember what it opened. He sat in his grandmother's chair in the quiet house and let the evenings settle around him. And he did not check his phone. And he did not look back. I hope you enjoyed that one. Make sure to like the video and subscribe. I've already lined up 2 more stories that I think you're really going to love.